just want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I just want to thank you to our panel members for being here tonight in advance. We're very excited to just hear where this night goes. So as Victoria mentioned, we're going to start this night with a portion of me just asking them a few questions, and I give you all freedom to discuss this amongst yourself, but I'm going to direct the questions to an individual, and then if others of you have something to add, feel free. So that's going to be a little bit of how this first session, the section starts. So let's go ahead and hit the ground running. Judy, this one is for you. Why do relationships have the potential to cause pain?
Probably the easiest answer to that is we're not perfect yet. But I think there's a deeper reason. And probably what I would say is that we were created in a relational image, the image of God, 3 in 1. And that image places in us a longing for a relationship. And whenever we long for something, we begin to build expectations for it. We desire it in a deep way. And the reason God created us relationally is so that we could reflect to others, primarily the world, his relationship to us. And I think pain primarily comes because it's Satan's goal to destroy the reflection of God's image to the world. And so if he can somehow, through our upbringing, through many things, get us pulled into the world's way of relating, then we are going to have pain.
Would anybody else have anything to add to that?
I think what I so love about Judy's comment is she talks about God being the ultimate fulfillment of that, and that sometimes we look to imperfect people to fill what only God is really designed to fill. So when she said expectations, that's what I thought of even in my own life, is when there's pain, it's often because I'm expecting someone to pull off what only God can pull off in my soul. And so then I'm disappointed and I'm hurt and I'm angry when they can't do that for me, even though they were really never designed to do it. But I'll keep going back to them as a source for that. So that expectation really kind of hits me in that way.
I want to say one more thing about that. Oswald Chambers, who is a real hero of mine, and I love to read him, and he has a quote, and he says, Jesus never trusted any man. And still he was never bitter, never resentful, never felt that pain that we're talking about, because he placed his trust in God first. And what God was going to do in man, he didn't place his trust in man, he placed it as his trust in the grace of God at work in man. And I think if we could do that more, it would erase a lot of pain.
Just to add to that too, I definitely agree with what you guys are both saying. Especially loved your comment, we're just not perfect yet. I think there's a lot of it there for sure. But also going off of what you were saying, Kathleen, that these expectations that we have of other people, I think those end up being especially painful in relationships because we're usually not aware of them. You know, it'd be hard enough if we had expectations that the other person wasn't meeting and it was a very conscious thing, but most of the time I don't think it is. We have these expectations that our friend or our boyfriend or our girlfriend or spouse will do something that we're not even aware of. And so that, I think, makes the pain greater and more confusing as we go through it, is just that lack of even knowing that we're hoping for those things, much less hoping for them in the wrong places sometimes.
When I saw this, I thought they have the potential for pain because they have the potential for so much joy. And we're built for relationship and joy. And the fact that they call us pain is because these relationships are in a fallen world in which those legitimate needs we have for a relationship and the legitimate joy that comes from that is accompanied by disappointments. People will not meet those needs. They will fail us. And you can't have a relationship without the risk of pain. So you risk loving, and inevitably you expose yourself to the possibility of pain. To try to avoid pain is to avoid intimacy, to avoid true connection. It involves risk, and pain is inevitably a part of that. And processing that is a part of growing and becoming more mature in relational functioning. I tell people, you can have high expectations, but you better be good at absorbing disappointment. and be really good at what we call metabolizing, digesting disappointment. And sometimes we scale our expectations down just to avoid pain. And that kind of keeps us from living the full range of what God intended for us. He took a great risk creating us in the way he did, that we could love and return or refuse and rebel. But he didn't back away from that risk because his love was deep. And I think that's the other side of that. Yeah.
I think that's a great model to look at what God has, how he's come to us and risked receiving pain on his own behalf. Yeah. Kristen, this one is specifically for you, but again, you all have the freedom to respond. How do you handle pain in relationships? That's part one. And what does grief look like in the context of a relationship?
Those are such broad questions, but I guess the first answer, based on what we've already said, is when you have pain in relationships, don't be surprised. If you're in a relationship long enough and you're doing things right, there's going to be pain. By doing things right, I mean you're not avoiding and pretending everything's perfect when it's not. So I guess the biggest thing is just enter into that. Expect it and be able if it's appropriate with the other person, otherwise with other community and wise counsel and mentors or therapists, to enter into that pain and allow yourself to grow from it. Which really, as I say that, might sound kind of funny, but it's coming out of the mindset that relationships aren't just about making us happy. They're about helping to make us holy too, helping us to grow and become more Christ-like. So that pain can often be an opportunity, as much as it sucks in the moment, to enter into that growth. Having said that, there are probably times when pain in relationships is a red flag that something is wrong too. So that's probably a good reason, again, especially as you're dating, to have community and counsel around you to help you discern, is this one of those times where this is mirroring who I am and I can grow through that? Or is this really a red flag that this is not the right person for me and the right relationship? And I think the second half of your question was about grief. Grief is going to be there anytime we have loss. So that could come at any time, probably especially when a relationship is lost, but I'm sure there's times, within it, like with the disappointment we are talking about, where there could be grief. And it's going to look just like it does with anything else in your life when you experience grief, that you may have all kinds of emotions, sadness, anger, guilt, relief even, and all kinds of symptoms. You might have trouble sleeping or eating or remembering things. And again, I think the best thing to do is not run away from it, but just enter into that with others and with God, and take the risk and the courage to walk through that and be more whole and more holy for it, as hard as it is.
Pain is a symbol of, or a manifestation of something's wrong. And so learning to discern pain and to allow it to tell us what we need to know is an important part of maturing. Minimizing pain or saying it's not that important to me, those are ways to cope, but they're usually avoidance strategies that prevent growth and may short-circuit the grieving process. Pain should motivate us to engage in restoration. I just had a kidney removed 3 weeks ago, and it was zero functioning. And when the doctor took it out, he said, "Man, that thing was big. It was about 4 times its normal size." He said, "I can't believe you weren't in any pain." And I said, well, now that I think about it, I probably was. I wasn't attending to it, and over time, it didn't point to the thing that I needed to get fixed. And learning to embrace healthy pain is a part of maturing. What I would say grief looks like in a relationship is grief shared. That what is shareable, the phrase we use is what is shareable is bearable. And particularly relational pain is something that shouldn't be borne alone. And sharing that in the context of counsel or community, and especially with the people for whom are the source of our pain, being able to share it in a way that invites compassion, not provokes defensiveness. And that usually is, if I have pain, you did this to me, that's an angry attack response that's going to provoke defensiveness, will not produce connection and healing. Versus, I'm really hurting, I want to tell you what happened and why it mattered to me, invites that person to be compassionate in response. If the focus is, I'm going to handle my pain by telling you what you did wrong in anger, it almost never produces the healing reconciliation you need. To be able to show the pain in a way that invites, says, this is what happened to me, and this is why it happened, why I feel this way, is a more vulnerable place, but it invites a more compassionate response. And my work with couples is to really allow grief to be shared and compassion to be expressed. Grief shared is bearable.
I don't want this moment to leave without saying there also can be found joy in pain. And many of you know that I went through cancer last year. And in that process, I learned that in suffering, and we can blame, just like we can in relationship. We can complain. We can fall into deep places of depression. Those are all the temptations that we have in relationship when there's pain. But what I found was that as I looked back over my life, when I found that when I was first diagnosed with cancer, and I looked back over my life as I was doing a family sculpture actually for a class, I realized that God, every time I was in sickness and pain, that God gave me something new and turned my life in new directions. And in that moment, I had joy. I had excitement. I thought, wow, he must be going to do something here too. And I think sometimes if we turn to God and find his compassion, allow ourselves to be humble enough to know that we can't deal with this alone, that he will meet us there. And it's in that moment that we will find his greatest love. And so to be able, I don't think I ever thought that I would be able to say that I would find joy in suffering, but last year, there were moments when I did.
You just made me think, too, how much, in addition to finding that joy in the pain, how much intimacy can be found there with what Dr. Edwards was saying. You know, if you're able to not attack and you did this and you did that, but instead share, you know, this, I really felt hurt, and this really reminded me of the time such and such happened, and really enter into that it can be intimacy with the other person and with God as you go through that process, as well as finding the joy.
As I'm looking out here, I see men and women, and I really see a gender difference in the ability to be vulnerable in this way. Especially guys, when you're hurt in a relationship, often our only tool in the toolbox is anger. And because we've been hurt and we don't like that. And so I really encourage, especially men, to be able to grieve in a way that invites compassion. And that is by bearing that, by experiencing that pain with a sense of internal focus of this is where I'm hurting, versus an external focus of this is what you did that's bad. And that may invite healing and reparation, healing and repair.
Yeah, I feel like you're pointing to this idea of repair and how powerful repair is in this process.
Right.
That's great. Kathleen, this one is specifically for you. How do you know when you are just working through a hard season in a relationship versus when it is time to walk away?
A couple things came to mind, and I think this is such a interesting age that you're in, is you're going to, in the next maybe 5 years, make some of the biggest decisions of your life. And it is tense, and it's kind of, it can be very filled with stress. And for some of you, especially if your family background has been pretty tough, and maybe your parents have been through divorce or there's something painful, this whole decision-making process, do I stay in the relationship or leave it, can feel kind of overwhelming. And as I reflected on the question, something really struck me, is for those people that I've met with over the last 15, 20 years who are in very painful marriages, it's striking to me how many of them had friends and family members pull them aside before they made the decision to marry, and they were told by these people in their life, I have very serious concerns about this. And I went through the whole list of people, and I could only think of one person who did not feel she was really warned. Everybody else felt they were warned. And so I think it's so important when you're making this kind of decision about commitment is to pay attention to the people who have a proven track record of loving you and a proven track record of wanting your best. And if they're showing concern about the relationship you're in, at least see that as a yellow flag and consider getting some counsel and consider getting some help before you move forward. But in general, I thought of two different kind of polar opposite dynamics that you might want to consider, and just things I saw as I worked at Biola as a resident director. These two different dynamics would crop up quite a bit. And one type of relationship would be a pretty controlling relationship, and the other type of relationship that crossed my mind, I referred to it more as the string-along kind of relationship. And in the controlling relationship, what you'll see is there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of volatility, there's kind of arguments happen on a daily or weekly basis. There's pretty intense arguments between the couple about a whole variety of issues. And what you'll notice in relationships that really need to be seriously examined is that you won't see over time trust developing. For some reason, no matter how much time they spend together, no matter how many conversations they have, they are not able to develop trust with one another. And they're not able to get to a place where they're able to have healthy conflict resolution. So the same argument will cycle around and around and around, and they aren't able to de-escalate the situation and come to an understanding that actually moves them forward. But in those relationships, there can be a lot of intense emotion and a deep feeling of connection and a real hard time letting each other go. And if you're finding yourself in that dynamic or you're seeing that dynamic, I just encourage you, get some kind of counsel, get some kind of care. But you'll see each person walking on eggshells. And in one sense or another, they'll feel real agitated and anxious about the other person's perception, that they might upset the person if they don't return a text right away. My boyfriend will get really upset, or my girlfriend will get really upset. If I don't always sit by them in the calf, they'll be really upset. If I don't always sit with them at chapel, they're going to be really upset. And there's this sense in the relationship that you're walking on eggshells. There's also a sense of isolation. You become more and more consumed with one another and withdraw more and more from the rest of the community. So if you're dating someone and over the course of the relationship, you're finding that it's no longer okay to have friends. He or she is jealous, even of your same-sex friends. They're uncomfortable with your relationship with your family. You're no longer engaging in normal hobbies or activities because the relationship you're in is so consuming. Those are all signals that you're in a highly controlling relationship that is potentially the groundwork for emotional or physical abuse. So these are big yellow/red flags that something is not healthy and something is not functioning well in the relationship. In addition, and I don't know if the panel has any thoughts on that, because I had the other string-along kind of relationship. I don't know if you want me to go into that, or does the panel want to say anything about the controlling? No?
No, you did a good job.
Hey, I did a good job. They're PhDs, so I'm going to take that. I was feeling pretty good about that.
A+.
Get that recorded? Thank you. The other one, and then along the lines of that, going back to the controlling relationship, one of the things that might be going on is we all need love. We all need to feel cared about. We all need a sense of acceptance. If I don't have any of that inside me, if I have not internalized that, what I can do is what's called externalizing. I will look for something outside of me to try to provide that internal confidence or internal sense of being loved. So I might define that by saying, you always have to pay attention to me for me to feel loved. You always have to be available the minute I need you for me to feel secure. You can't pay attention to anybody else for me to feel accepted by you. And when you start to do those things, I will get angry. When you start to do things that feel threatening to me, I'm going to try to control you. And if you accommodate that kind of behavior in a relationship, you're setting yourself up for something that's just really, really dysfunctional. You will never be able to fix that hole in the other person. That's a hole that was created before you ever met them. That is damaged in their soul that really needs compassionate attention. And it needs the help of them being willing to ask for help, but it needs the help of somebody who can do a little bit more intense emotional work with them and spiritual work with them. So sometimes you can think, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to save them, I'm going to help them overcome that, and that just usually doesn't work out very well. That just doesn't happen. The other one is the string-along relationship, and this is a relationship where you'll see just a lack of commitment, but there's some kind of intense emotional sharing or even physical intimacy, but there's no commitment. And what you'll see in this kind of relationship is there's an unreliability factor. This is someone who pops in and out of your life. They only show up when they need something or when they want something from you. And that may just be, I want to talk, I want to process, or it may mean I need your help. But that's the only time you see them, and you don't have a sense that you could ask them for anything. You don't get the sense that they would respond to you and to your needs. They seem kind of unavailable. This is someone who won't include you in other parts of their life, so they never introduce you to their friends or to their family. They keep you kind of isolated and over here on your own. This is someone who either won't take you out on dates and really pursue you, or it's somebody, if it's a female and you're a guy, she's evasive and she won't go out on dates with you. She puts it off, she sort of avoids it, and she won't ever say, yes, let's go out on it. You just know that you can't really ask her out on a date. If you're in a situation like this, you're probably involved with someone who likes some aspects of you and gets some needs met, but they do not want a commitment from you, and they don't want to be involved with you. And that's really hard to face. Rejection is incredibly hard to face. We really resist it. But if this is the pattern, and this is going on for months, there's something really wrong with this relationship. And I can't stress enough, too, some of the people I've spoken with who are in this dynamic with someone who is actually involved in a dating relationship with someone else. So they're dating someone, and yet this guy or girl will come to you to process what they don't like about the person they're dating. But the relationship they're developing with you is pretty intimate. And they may even be alluding to, man, if things don't work out with this other person, I could see myself with you, and not making a commitment, staying kind of selfish in this whole system. And there are times when it's just time to cut that off. If this person really loves you and is really interested in you, they will ask you out. If it's a female, if she's really interested in you, she will let you pursue her. If they're putting up boundaries, if they're keeping you out of their life, chances are they are still in a stage of life where they just are maybe using people and they haven't developed empathy or an understanding of what it means to be in an intimate relationship that's mutual. So those would be the two that I would say this is not functional and it's not healthy. And there's probably not a lot of hope in this particular scenario. It's probably better to get some help and to move on.
Well, we can continue this discussion, but our next question is very similar. This one is for Keith. What are some signs that you're not meant to be in relationship?
I look at this one and the question next for Kristen about when something about should you break up. I want to respond first to the word not meant to be in a relationship. And I don't know if somehow that means you're trying to discern, is this what God wants for me? Or is this the person, I'm looking for the person God has for me. That language often clouds your ability to look at a relationship realistically. And that gets us off into another discussion. But with regard to just the question of, is this relationship for me? And it is very much related to the previous question. Is you need a model of what does a healthy relationship look like? And so I'm going to refer you to a book if you're interested. I use it. Oh, can I make a plug? I teach an undergrad class called The Psychology of Marriage. Okay, so if you want to consider that. And I have a colleague, Dr. Jenny Pock, who also teaches a section of that course. It's offered now every semester. And I've had feedback from a lot of students that it helped them tremendously in handling relationship issues before marriage. There's a book called How Not to Marry a Jerk. The subtitle is Or Jerkette. So just in case you feel that puts too much emphasis on the males. It's by a fellow named John Van Epp, E-P-P. And he systematically lays out a process of really intentionally entering into a relationship with awareness, with a set of ideas and standards of what does a healthy relationship look like, and how do I think reflectively. Van Epp is a Christian. The book is published by a secular publisher. But there is a process of bonding that he lays out very nicely in what's called the attachment bond. And we understand real clearly now how human beings bond, and they move through a series of steps. And if you know what those steps are and you can see, are we able to get to this step as partners? Are we able to collaborate and meet our needs mutually? And the more extreme form that Kathleen was talking about, the controlling relationship and abuse, it's difficult to know when a relationship is unresponsive and not meeting needs and there's not a good match, but it's not abuse per se. And the more extreme of the controlling marriage, controlling relationship. The thing about dating is you can leave a relationship. She made a reference to married people who come in and say, I had signs. My practice is primarily couples. It's very difficult when people are married and they've made a commitment before God to really reflect and say, boy, this relationship is very unhealthy for me. And to try to repair that when you really feel you have no other option. But in your relationships as dating, you are really in a position of making choices, and those are difficult choices to make. And I want to endorse something else Kathleen says. You need to be in a community. You need to be with people in your life. And I think the sign that other people around you who speak into your life and who love you and have more objectivity, and if they say to you, I'm really concerned about this, boy, that should be a red flag that you look at. And I have so many times I hear people say they ignored all of those statements because they were in love. And that emotion is very powerful, and we know love makes you dumb. Okay, we have neurological evidence that love makes you dumb. When you're in love, it shuts down your prefrontal cortex, and your rational ability to look at things is totally impaired. So you have to go to someone else to really get a perspective on yourself. You need a standard and a model. And the book, How Not to Marry a Jerk, is a lovely laying out of all these principles. Very helpful.
Can I add to that real quick? I totally affirm again, community, community, community. And also just on this topic of how do you discern, is this just a hard time, I think it was, or time to move on? The biggest question that comes to my mind is, can you live with this for the rest of your life? Especially if it's amplified 5 or 10 times. Because love can make you dumb, and it can make you blind, and it can make you think, oh yeah, this really annoys me, or we
You basically need a handicap sign.
You what?
You basically need a handicap parking sign when you're in love. You're
Yeah.
blind, you're dumb, you
Seriously,
can't hear.
that would be good. We can get those. Yeah, I like it. But you might think, oh, we have this constant fight, or this really annoys me. But we're going to get married and we're going to live together, and it's all going to go away. Most people have the exact opposite experience, that once you get married, those fights, those
Yep.
things that annoy you, just get amplified. So that would be an important question to ask yourself as you're trying to figure out, is this the right person? Can you live with this times 5 or times 10 for the rest of your life?
Yeah, that's a very important point. 2 things I say to students is your dating is about as good as it's going to get. If you're counting on it getting better, and that's a bit of a cynical statement because you can rebuild,
I hope
but
so.
but inevitably, but what it does is it alludes you to the fact that you're going to go through a period in those early years of marriage, and the studies are really clear on this, that it goes down after you get married, and healthy marriages need the tools to reestablish the upward building on a more solid foundation. And there's a writer who describes what Kristen said is, when you choose, and I say this to students, you think you got married because of love, but really, when you chose to marry that person, what you decided is, that's a set of problems I can live with. Now, that's not necessarily a very romantic thought, but that's really what's under. I'm going to marry this person because that's a set of problems I think I'm going to live with. Now, we can't know all of what that person is about. And I tried to show my wife as much of my colors as I could before we got married. She's sitting right here if you want to check it out later on 46 years of marriage. But you need a model to know how to make these decisions. And Scripture gives us a good model, and some of these other wisdom books that would be helpful.
And I would say, too, that if you're really walking down a road where you're thinking you're moving towards marriage, don't get engaged. Go talk to someone who can really take a look at the relationship deeply with you. And do pre-engagement counseling. There's something about getting engaged that it's really hard to break up. It's already become almost married. I know couples do it, but it would be much better to take that deeper look at your relationship before you go buy that ring and put it on her finger, and your whole community is looking and excited about moving you towards marriage. And then you come back and say, no, I went to counseling and I'm seeing some things that I don't know that I can live with the rest of my life. So I would just say those pre-engagement counseling appointments could be really, really helpful for you to be able to take a deeper look at your relationship and make decisions and choose what you want to live with for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think I'm getting this theme of just leaning into community in this process of dating, really entrusting the relationship and allowing those you love and care for to give you good advice and to allow you to go into this with eyes as open as you possibly can. Judy, I'm going to cap off this time just with a question directed towards you. How can pain and upbringing affect my relationships? And are they even connected?
I would love to say no. Your relationship is just you and the other person. But it's just not true. Because God placed us He didn't grow us up before He put us on this earth. Instead, he put us in a family. And your mom and dad, your siblings, your relationships in that family were not perfect. And they formed an interrepresentational model, or a pre-wiring for relationship in your brain. I mean, you really have a model for relationship that comes from your family of origin. And some of you found a lot of security and acceptance and grace and empowerment from your family. And some of you found distance, or distance from one parent and closeness from another, maybe even too close, holding on. Some of you were raised in single parent homes. All these things are forming that model of relationship within your brain. And when you start dating, it goes through that grid. And so that's where our expectations get built in our family of origin oftentimes. We begin to dream about relationships that maybe are more fulfilling than what we were hoping for in our families. And we never look back at our families to blame them. I believe that the majority of parents love their children to the very greatest degree that they possibly know how, that they can. And still, it's not going to be all that you need, you desire, you want. And so when you get into other relationships, some of those desires and needs and unmet needs are going to bleed out into your relationship. And you are, sometimes the need is so great, you become demanding for it, or you wonder about it. I remember one of the things in my family of origin that I really desired to have. And I wanted my dad just to say he loved me. I wanted him to do more than just go to work and provide for me. And pretty soon, internally, I began to feel unlovable. And even though my husband and I got married, I used to lay in bed at night when we were first married and think, well, if he does this, and this, then I'll feel loved. You know, then I'll know that he really loves me. And he would do those things, and I was still wanting. And it was because I didn't even know how to receive those things, because they weren't in my family of origin. I didn't know how to open my heart to the way a person can love. And so, yes, our families of origin set the model. Now, can the model change? Absolutely. It changes throughout life with all intimate relationships. It doesn't even have to be a marital relationship. If it's a relationship that's secure and you can begin to trust and there's grace in that relationship, you can be honest and they're curious about you and who you are, and when they hear it, they aren't shocked and push you away, but they embrace you. Those kind of relationships will begin to change your model of relationship internally. And that's why all of us up here are emphasizing community. I always say high school ought to be a great time to learn intimate relationships with the same gender, to find out what it's like to get close and be embraced by the same gender, and to learn more about yourself. And college ought to be a time when we get to begin to mix with the opposite gender and get to know them, because we've already experienced some intimacy in same gender relationships. And so those models inside of us are flawed. And we need intimate relationships to change those. And if you put all that weight on one person, your marriage, you're putting a noose around the other's neck. And you're tying them into something they can't provide for you. And you're heading for divorce. And so it's really important that we have other intimate relationships in our life to hold us in our relationship to God and in our relationship to others. We need people around to encourage and love and hear our pain and love us there.
The other aspect of that I want to emphasize that's kind of in my mind as I'm thinking about how this sounds. We are products of our histories. You have a learning history. And that's just the way we're built. That's the nature of the incarnation. I told someone earlier, I can make it so your past doesn't affect you, but you're not going to be able to find your way home. We call that Alzheimer's. If you want to be totally delivered from your past, you're not going to be much use because you won't be able to find your car where you parked it in the lot. We have memories, and those serve us to become more competent in the world. In this regard, then, what we know about relationships is not who you are now, but what you can grow to be. You can learn skills to transform yourself and the relationships you're in. There are ways to talk. There are ways to approach people. There are things that you can learn to say, key ideas that we know a lot about. And what I find in working with couples is that if they will open up and are willing to learn and be responsible to act in the most effective way in the relationship and learn how to do that and look at how their past kind of predisposes them to do certain things that are not healthy. I grew up in a very dysfunctional home. My father was an alcoholic and very abusive. I saw a lot of violence in the home. I had a lot of trauma. And so I am kind of withdrawn in conflict. I do not like to argue. When I heard they joined teams in high school to argue, they called it the debate team. I just that's a dumb idea. And I didn't want anything to do with it. And so that's still there for me, but I've learned how to deal with conflict and how to stay plugged into people when they're upset with me and how to talk to people in ways that promote mutual understanding. So these skills are learnable. The Bible is full of wisdom in this regard on how to relate. And the upside of this is all relationships, even though they involve risk, are the crucible within which God transforms us. And if you stay out of relationships and intimacy and you don't take risk, you're not going to grow. They say no pain, no gain. And in relationships, that's so much the case. And if you embrace that with wisdom and guidance and protection and grace and mercy, you will grow. And I encourage you to seek them, even though they do offer pain, and to learn the skills as we know them that produce a healthy, loving relationship and contribute to our growth and the growth of others.
Particularly in conflict.
Yeah.
There's no two people alike, and so whenever two people get together, there's going to be differences, and there's going to be differences of opinion, differences of thought, differences of feeling, and we need to learn to embrace those differences, because it's in those differences that we will actually grow. As we begin to look at them honestly and openly instead of running away from it. They say one of the biggest things that causes divorce is people don't know what to do with conflict. They never learn the skills of dealing with conflict. And so I really agree. There's a lot of good books. There's a lot of trained people that can teach you how to be in conflict. Just learning how to confront in truth and grace is just, the Bible teaches us how to do that. But we don't do it very often. Oftentimes in conflict, we turn our backs and we walk the other way.
Well, thank you, panel members, for your initial responses to these questions. At this point, we're going to open it up to the audience. So I'd encourage you, if you've brought in a question that you're just itching to ask, or some of the comments that have been made up here have been percolating some things in your own self, and a question has come from that. There's going to be a few people with microphones that are going to be walking around. So go ahead and put your hand up, and they will find you, and you can ask a question of the panel up here.
Okay, there we go. We're going to start with one question that was submitted ahead of time. Should you or can you stay friends after a breakup? We'll let you simmer on that for a moment, and then if you want to write down a question, feel free to shoot your hand up. Tyler will come around with additional pieces of paper, or if you want to say it into the mic, we can do that. So can you stay friends after a breakup?
Yes. Is
Yes.
it hard? Yes.
Yes.
If the process goes in a healthy way, that there is a mutual sense of this is not working, or an understanding that is done respectfully, that you can. There will be sensitivities, there will be raw spots that'll get rubbed, but avoidance is never a good growth strategy. Now, the first year I taught my psychology of marriage class, I started teaching, and a student in the front row or over in the row was in tears. I hadn't really said anything very profound, and I couldn't understand it, and a couple of times she missed. Well, she came to see me and let me know what was going on. That summer, she had been dating someone for 2 years. They went out, they bought an engagement ring, he gave her the engagement ring, he called her up on the phone about a week later and broke up with her, broke the engagement on the phone, and would not see her. I mean, that was so devastating, so dysfunctional. There were no explanations, so many unanswered questions, so many dashed hopes. It was so disorienting. And there was no space to talk about that, to work it through. And that's a very extreme example, but we need to know how to end relationships well. Because if they don't end well, you take into the next relationship unfinished business that will then get activated. And you grow in those moments. It's difficult as it is, and I know myself, dealing with people that we've had conflict with, avoidance is a much easier strategy, but it's never a solution.
I'd just like to add to that I agree, in an ideal world, you can have the mutual sense that this isn't right and move on. But I've seen a lot of people too where the staying friends is almost an avoidance of the breakup, at least on one side, that there can be one person who's not acknowledging this is over and thinks if they just stay friends, the other person's going to come around. Yep. And that's really not a healthy situation. So I think both people need to be honest with themselves, and you can pay attention to the other person's heart too. And if it is still stringing either person along, then you at least need a long break before that friendship can continue.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Are there signs to know whether you should...
Hold on just one sec. We're going to get the mic working for you.
Singleness, like about singleness?
Singleness.
What about singleness? Would you like to? It exists.
Are there some signs, like in your personality, do you think that that are that something that like are there something about people that are single, like to know that? You know what I mean?
You mean to maintain singleness and not get married, or not to date to get married?
So living a life of celibacy, if you're maybe called to that, is that kind of what you're?
Never mind. Well, I'll take that one. How about
I think we figured it out.
I
Good work.
don't know if I'm going to answer your question, so I'm not totally sure if this is hitting it. But some of you may be concerned that you would like to get married, but there's something about some people that end up single, and do you have that disease? And I'm single, so I can say that. And I will just say 90% of people get married. The question is, how healthy will the marriage be? That is what we've been trying to talk to you about. And I think as someone who's older and single, if you have to pick between singleness and a bad marriage, I highly recommend staying single. And some of you, when I was in high school, I became a Christian in high school. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and I read Paul's verse that it was better for some to stay single for the sake of the gospel. And when I read that verse, I said, Lord, if that's what you want for me, then enable me to do that. Because that, and you have to understand, I was a new Christian, but I was like, that sounds kind of great. And if you do end up being single for a long time or indefinitely, I don't know, it's people sometimes, this was a funny thing. So I didn't grow up in a Christian home or a Christian school. I was so shocked when I went to my 20th high school reunion, because when people would ask me about my marital status, nobody looked at me and said, oh, are you single? Oh, I'll pray for you. Like I had a disease. Okay, does that make sense? But with the Christian circles, it's a really big deal. And when people know I've been single, the assumption is always that I'm unhappy or that something went wrong, and I'll often get asked questions along those lines. It can be the best life if that's what God's calling you to. And if you think he might be calling you to that, and you have concerns about all the details moving forward of what that could look like, I just encourage you to be really honest with the Lord about your concerns. Very transparent with him, very open with him. I'm afraid it could mean this, I'm afraid it could mean this, I'm afraid it could mean this. Could you talk to me about that? Could you give me some reassurance about that? The hardest thing about it has been, at times in the evangelical circle, the social stigma. But other than that, there has been, the benefits for me have been tremendous. I feel like the Lord has given me such a rich life and such a good life. His goodness is what it is. And it's really not dependent on your marital status. It is what it is. His love is what it is. And you can be married and not experience his love. You can be married and experience his love. The same thing with being single. And you have good days and you have bad days, just like being married. You have days you love your lifestyle and days you wish you could change it for something else. Marriage isn't the ticket. Single isn't the ticket. It's knowing the Lord, loving him, growing in him, walking with him. That is the abundant life. The rest of it is our circumstance. It really is.
I want to add a little bit to that breakup and can you stay friends, because I don't want to be too cavalier about it. Depends on the intensity of the bond that you had in the relationship. And if you're friends if you're in the same environment, same community, same town, you're going to have unavoidable contact with the other person, but you will have an emotional vulnerability to that person, and processing that loss is probably going to require some distance. I think that's what Kristen was alluding to, and I agree with that, so I don't want to sound too cavalier about that. Inevitably, when we form a bond with a person and that ends, there's a vulnerability there. And we need a space and time to process that loss. And I think at that time, it does require some distance. And if you can come back together for other reasons, if you have affinities for other reasons, then rebuilding that can be done on another basis. But if there isn't some break in which you're processing the loss and moving forward and getting some clear head about it, I think it can be confusing. So I'd agree with that at least a period of time where no, you can't be friends, because you need to process that.
Thanks, Keith, for kind of finishing that. And Kathleen, I think you say some very important things about the value of singleness, of just entering that, of the good of that.
As you were saying that, Kathleen, what I wanted to say is marriage is what happens when you're on your life of developing your identity and becoming who you are. If your primary goal is to get married, that becomes a distortion of the deeper process of becoming who God wants you to be. And it's almost, to me, love is an accident. It happens between two people who are side by side in ministry serving some other purpose. And when people kind of make getting in a relationship their primary purpose, it distorts the process. And I love it. I have this image in my mind of join the Sierra Club. If I were single, I'd join the Sierra Club. And if I met someone there who liked the Sierra Club, maybe it would work out. But I'm there because I love nature. And the affinity that forms between the two is because we're both serving the same purpose. And out of that comes a really healthy bond. If our primary purpose, ring before spring, if I could quote get your MRS degree, and all the pressure that puts on us, it distorts your ability to discern God's will for your life and to develop and enrich the gifts you have serving God. And whether that emerges in a relationship with someone else or not isn't life or death for you.
I think that's a good word. Thank you. Thank you. Is there any other questions out there? Okay.
Don't jump right back in. And what I have found in working with people is that particularly men have the tendency to jump right back into a relationship, particularly after divorce. Now, in dating, that may not be quite as true. But there's a sense that once you have experienced some intimacy and then it's cut off from you, first you rage and you blame, and then you grieve and want to fill the hole. And then the grieving never gets done. And so it's really important that the grieving has to go through a process before you enter another relationship. And again, that's good to be processing with somebody. Someone who can be there and not someone who you can fall in love with. Someone older maybe, someone of your in your community that you trust that has some wisdom in this area. But to be processing with them some of even the anger and the rage, and God can hear that too, but we need to be able to get beyond that before we start moving into another relationship that's going to be intimate, because we will just carry that grief into that relationship, and you'll hold yourself back in places that you were hurt before. You won't let the other person see that part of you. You'll protect yourself, and the relationship really doesn't have the ability to be as intimate as what it could be as if you were free from that other relationship.
On that note, just to add to that, obviously there's no length of time. You know, we can't say 6 months or 1 month. It depends on you and what the relationship was like and how fast you can go through that process. One thing to keep in mind is, I think when you're content and even happy with your life again and with being single, then you might be about ready to jump into a new relationship.
I was also thinking, you had mentioned coming out of an emotionally draining relationship. It might be worth taking time to understand what went on in that relationship, and were there things, Judy mentioned your childhood, kind of setting up this filter and grid for how you approach relationships as an adult, and were there maybe deeper issues for how you got into a relationship that felt at the end of the day so incredibly draining? And if you don't understand how that dynamic started to work out between the two of you, you could walk into a new relationship and repeat the dynamic. It might look slightly different, but it'll, in all likelihood, look unhealthy. And then you might begin to associate all relationships with being draining, exhausting, miserable, when what might be going on is just something needs to be taken a look at in your soul that's been hurt or damaged, and it needs to be healed before you can have a better bond with another person.
Just a quick follow-up. My assumption is part of this process would be engaging community, getting into therapy, processing these things. How do you feel like you would engage God kind of in this process of breaking up? And Judy, you mentioned different stages of grieving, anger. What does it look like to, and even this last piece of wanting to fill it with something else, what would it look like, do you think, to engage God in this kind of real mourning process.
Well, I really think we have to ask, does God have purpose in unrequited love? And I really think oftentimes when relationships break, that God would desire that we feel that longing with himself. And so that longing that is in your heart from love being turned away from you is really a hole that only God can fill. And so unrequited love can actually bring us to a place where we can be more aware of our own longings for God, and that he desires and wants to fill those places in us. And you said, but oftentimes when you get rejected, you're angry with God. And God can hear that. He knows that. You may be even blaming him for the breakup of a relationship. Why couldn't you have done something? And talk to God about that. Let him hear what you feel. And but in the end, when you get through the rage and you begin to get into the grief, you'll begin to be able to experience some of that longing for relationship again. And primarily, that longing for relationship is all about our longing for God. And when we have other relationships, we often use those relationships to fill the places that God really desires to be. And it's important that we use these times of grief to be able to really get in touch with how much our heart longs to be one with God.
And it can be such an opportunity in that for intimacy with God as you're pouring out your heart to him, whether it's sadness or anger or whatever it's coming up, those longings, any of that, just like you would, your best friend of all time, that can be an opportunity for growth, but also just intimacy with God.
There's a good book on this. It's by Laura Smith. It's called He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not, or it's He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not. And it's about what we do when we are cut off from relationships. So it might be a book you might like to read.
We're getting a lot of written questions here about divorce. Is divorce ever a valid option? Is it just wrong, period? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, clearly Scripture says God hates divorce. He gives infidelity as what we would refer to as a biblical basis for divorce. I'll answer that question by saying that a healthy relationship is characterized by a sense of safety. That is, that this is a safe haven for me to be in. I'm not subject to abusive dynamics, physically safe. And that I feel secure. This other person is mindful of my needs, cares about me. They're faithful. And we're mutually responsive to each other's needs and available for being responsive to those needs. And if the relationship doesn't fulfill those, then you look for ways in the church and within community to learn the skills to restore that and confront where it's not. And so my observation is many divorces never need to happen if people will simply submit themselves. And this is because my work is all with couples, and I've worked with couples now for 25 years, and my wife and I travel and work with missionary couples in Asia and Africa and Europe. And we see, even in these committed couples, really severe dysfunction that over time we can come in and repair and help them on the road to recovery. So the first issue is don't give up. There are resources, pursue resources. But then the bottom line for being in a relationship, and I'm not using the word divorce here, is am I just emotionally safe? Am I subject to emotional abuse? That's where serious questions have to be about, I have to make a judgment in that regard, and that's a very difficult call because the pressure on you in the community will be to not divorce. Now, what I do with couples where I think safety is an issue is I will say separation. And I don't use the word divorce, and I never tell anybody to get divorced. I help them look at their relationship and look at their options and what they need to learn to do, and is the other partner responsive? And I want to help them stay together. But people have to feel safe, and without safety you can't develop in a healthy way. And so I do at times see, and this is pretty rare, couples where separation is really the only choice for. It's a little bit like when you have an alcoholic and you confront that person, you have to break the relationship in order to give that person a chance to decide if they're going to recover or not. And the classic intervention strategy for dealing with people who are unresponsive alcoholics is to say, I can't relate to you as long as you're behaving in this dysfunctional way. So I'm going to separate. And sometimes when it's physically abusive, there has to be a separation. There are some, if you read The Sacred Marriage by Gary Thomas, I think, there's a chapter in there where a person separated from their spouse, and they prayed for 3 or 4 years for that relationship to be restored. They were not going for divorce. They were committed to God's blessing on that marriage. And that other partner went off and got married to someone else. But they remained faithful in the pursuit of that relationship. Now, what that would mean for you, I don't know. But there's way too many divorces. People give up way too soon because they just don't know how they're contributing to their misery in the way they're behaving, the way they're doing it. And that's what grieves my soul. I think divorces will happen, but we don't pursue healing. And what's really sad in the church is you cannot show a troubled marriage in a church. Everybody puts on airs. There's not a safe place to say, I'm hurting. I need help. I want somebody looking at this. And I see it, one of the partners too proud, they fight it off, they control. And I've seen couples who go and open up in community who are restored in ways people would have given up on. So don't give up, and pursue righteousness by learning and pursuing restoration. That's what God is about.
Go ahead.
Just to add real quickly, you mentioned the Bible's real clear that God hates divorce. And I think to understand that, we have to understand that marriage is meant to be a mirror of God's relationship with the church and his love of us. And so just like it would be unnatural to rip us, it is unnatural to rip us out of God's hands, it would be unnatural to rip apart a marriage. And that's why he hates it, because he knows that it rips out our heart and soul when we go through it, as well as a lot of, the children involved or people around us. And that doesn't mean it's the cardinal sin, but that it is devastating.
I just want to say real quickly, for you, don't get married with divorce being an option for you.
Great. We have one question back here.
There's a saying, married to the job. What are the warning signs of such a relationship?
I didn't hear the first part.
There's a saying, married to the job.
Oh.
What are the signs of such a relationship?
Okay. You mean where the job it takes more time? Do you mean that, or that the job is fulfilling needs that a relationship would fulfill? I'm not sure which way you mean that.
Either one works.
Oh, okay.
The first thoughts that come to my mind are, if someone's already a workaholic, it's probably only going to get worse, just like we talked about earlier. Whatever you're seeing now, it's just very possibly could be more so in marriage. And I think other signs, just generally that kind of difficulty would be if there's difficulties already in connection and in intimacy. If the person runs from connecting with you in times of conflict or something, then yeah, they might run to their job when things get really hard. So any of those things I think could be signs.
Okay, we also have a submitted question. How do you cope when your boyfriend leaves you for your best friend?
Homicide is an option, I think.
Not divorced, though.
Yeah, that is
That
so
is tough.
hard. You cry a lot. I think you've got to find a safe place to process that, and something in one of the conversations earlier that I was reminded of, the benefit and the beauty of being in this community at Biola is you're all going through the same thing at the same time, and you're sharing a common experience. The drawback is you don't have maybe as much life experience and perspective. And so if someone has gone through a loss like that, you may find your friends are slightly limited in how much compassion or assistance they can be to you in that kind of a situation. So in that, to the degree to which they can comfort you or be a help to you, take advantage of that. But you may need to look to someone who's a little bit older, been farther down the road, to really process how deeply painful that situation is for you. Obviously, you're going to feel betrayed. Obviously, it may really deeply rattle your trust in people in general and your ability to move forward in intimate relationships. All of that will depend on your background and what life looked like before this happened. But don't process that alone. That's a huge wound. That is a really big deal. And again, if your friends are limited in what they can offer in terms of help, please look beyond that social circle and let some people walk through this with you.
Okay, we just have time for 2 more quick questions, so let's take that over there.
Yeah, it was funny because one of the notes I wrote I didn't mention about that was that you may know you need to get out of that relationship, and yet you're looking for the right time because it never seems like it's going to be the right time. And unless you have a sense that that other person, if you were to believe in the most extreme cases that person could become suicidal or somehow harm you, you definitely want to pull someone else in if that's the scenario. If you don't think it would get that extreme, you have to accept the fact that they're not going to be happy with this decision. There's probably not a good way to do it. Face to face, not in an email or in a phone call, like was mentioned earlier, is respectful. Owning your part, taking responsibility for anything that you think you might have done in the relationship that could have been damaging, and yet acknowledging it, but I still need to move forward and separate. And there's probably no way to completely cushion that. You just prayerfully be as honest and transparent without being unnecessarily hurtful. You don't have to go into lots of detail. You don't have to pick the other person apart to give them the list of 10 reasons why you don't want to be with them anymore, but you can say, I don't feel this is healthy, this is not working for me. I think we need to separate, and you kind of just be prepared. If you think there might be a fallout, just prepare yourself with a support system around you and some people that can help you if the other person gets vindictive or volatile or controlling in return.
One of the things that probably makes relationships difficult in this regard is we think, well, I don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. Somehow we feel really responsible, especially if you're the one doing the termination. So you may compromise your well-being out of a concern for the other person's emotion. And that's where love, a concern for the other, is not balanced with truthfulness, speaking the truth to one another. There's a phrase that I find helpful that kind of tries to balance those two. It says, I am responsible to you as a responsible partner, but I'm not responsible for you. And that's the emotional difference. I'm responsible to you to act in as a mature way and as a loving way as I can. How that plays out in your psyche in terms of your sense of rejection, disappointment, and pain is something ultimately you're responsible for. In Galatians, the first part of Galatians 6 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So that's the responsible to you. But down later it says in verse 6, we each must bear his own load. And ultimately, both of those are balanced. And there's never any clean mark, but if you know you're acting in good faith while you're speaking truth, and the effect that truth that has on them is ultimately something they will have to be responsible for. Don't be a prisoner. Don't be held hostage by somebody else's emotion. And the problem with the controlling person is they will work very hard to make you feel responsible for their feelings.
Okay, and our last question.
Hi, going back to the boyfriend leaving you for your best friend. I know we're supposed to be Christians and forgiving and stuff. What do you do when your ex-boyfriend's always blaming you and your so-called best friend is trying to still have a friendly relationship with you and still wants to be there, like still wants you to have them in their life and stuff? What's like the Christian way to like handle that situation?
I think it's important to remember that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting what happened. That forgiving is releasing the other person and yourself from, the pain and the responsibility of that. But it's not pretending that nothing happened and going on as if nothing occurred. So if there's boundaries you need to set, I think you can be real clear about that. The other people might want to stay good friends because they still care about you, and then they don't feel guilty if you guys can just all pretend like nothing happened. But that's okay if that doesn't work for you, which I wouldn't think it would, to say, yeah, you guys hurt me, I'm sorry, this has to change, or this has to stop, or whatever boundary it is that you need to set for yourself in that.
Yeah, this kind of depends about the emotional maturity of your friend. Are they, in your discussion with them, and I assume let's say your boyfriend saying bad things about you to them, do they know you separate from what your boyfriend is saying? Do they feel coerced to agree with him because of this relationship? That's going to distort her ability to be a healthy friend of yours. And I would pursue with that friend is, look, he's got his perspective. That's not the whole story. I need this to be about you and me. And I'm going to ask you to put a decent boundary in your relationship with your boyfriend and simply make it clear to him, if you want to be my friend, that I won't listen to your complaints about my friend anymore. That's not going to be a part of our relationship. You get this in families where a family member wants to complain about another family member, and the boundary is, I won't engage in that kind of backbiting. Those conversations are not helpful to me. That person's my friend. You had a different experience with them. And it's just not helpful to keep that in this relationship. If your friend can't do that kind of boundary setting, then you're probably going to have to back away from that relationship. And it would be understandable if that were too hard for her to do, to have that kind of good differentiation where she could put a boundary and protect you. But you're asking for basic protection of your relationship with her. And if she can't do it, you're probably going to have to back away from that relationship a bit. Because distance is the primary way you maintain emotional safety when people can engage in a healthy protection.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's go ahead and give them a round of applause.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.